Nayeli was hanging upside down from the wooden gate of the ranch. A thick rope was tightened around her ankle, leaving her body suspended in mid-air. One hand clung desperately to the crossbeam to keep her head from slamming into the ground. Blood rushed to her face, turning her vision into a blur of swaying red shadows. Her long black hair hung down in dusty tangles, sticking to her cheeks and neck. Her dress was torn to shreds, caked with dirt and dried sweat. Deep red and purple lash marks wrapped across her back and shoulders, overlapping like cruel signatures carved by hatred. Martha Kane stood beneath the blazing sun, a leather whip resting in her hand. She did not shout. She did not need to. Her voice was as cold as steel. "Where is the letter?" Nayeli did not answer. Every breath felt like her chest was being crushed in a vice. Her throat was so dry and raw she could not force out a single sound. The ranch hands stood at a distance, watching for a moment before turning away. No one wanted to get involved. "Not talking?" Martha's lips curled slightly. "I will hang you there until you confess." The wind swept across the dry fields. The wooden gate creaked softly. Nayeli felt the world spinning more and more slowly, but her hand still held tight. She had hidden the letter, and even if it cost her life, she would never let it fall into their hands. Through the haze of dizziness she heard another sound, the sharp rhythm of horse hooves coming to a stop on the dusty road. Then a man's voice rang out, deep and calm. "Take her down." The entire yard fell silent. The entire yard fell silent, like the air itself had been squeezed tight. Martha Kane turned her head. She narrowed her eyes at the man sitting tall on his horse, framed by the pale golden dust of the noon sun. He did not rush to dismount. He simply sat there, back straight, holding the reins loosely in one hand. Jonah Hale. His long coat was coated in road dust. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed half of his weathered face. His eyes settled on Nayeli's suspended body and did not move. 1 second, 2 seconds. There was no curiosity in that gaze. No contempt. Only one thing. A cold disbelief at something that should not exist. Martha spoke first, her voice sharp as a blade. "Family matter." "You keep riding, cowboy." Jonah did not answer right away. His eyes moved over the lash marks across the girl's back. He saw her fingers turned pale from gripping the wood too long. He saw the blood seeping from her ankle where the rope had rubbed the skin raw. Then he stepped down from his horse. The sound of his boots hitting the ground rang clear in the heavy silence. "She stole," Martha said, lifting her chin. "I am just teaching her a lesson." Jonah walked closer. He stopped a few steps away from Nayeli. From that distance he could hear her broken, uneven breathing. He could see the vein at her temple pounding violently beneath her skin. He spoke, his voice low, not raised, but strong enough for everyone to hear. "Take her down." It was not a request. It was not a request. Martha let out a short laugh. "And what right do you have to give orders here?" Jonah did not look at her. He was still looking at the girl hanging upside down. The right of a man who does not close his eyes when he sees something wrong. The air shifted. 2 stable hands stepped farther back. One of them swallowed hard. Jonah's horse pawed lightly at the dirt, as if it could feel the tension building. Martha tightened her grip on the whip. "This is my land." Jonah finally turned to face her. "No piece of land gives you the right to kill." The word kill dropped into the yard like a stone. Nayeli heard everything, but the sound seemed to echo from far away. The edges of her vision began to darken. Her hand slipped a few inches down the wooden beam. Jonah saw it. He walked straight toward the gate. Martha lifted the whip in warning. "Do not you." Jonah drew his knife. The steel blade flashed in the sunlight, and for the first time in hours, the rope was no longer as secure as it had been. If you value the old-fashioned principles echoed in stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel so we can continue sharing more with you. The blade flashed beneath the sun. Martha Kane stepped back half a pace, but the whip in her hand remained raised. "If you cut that rope, I will sue you for destroying my property." Jonah did not look at her. "Property does not breathe," he said. Nayeli heard the steel scrape against the rope, a dry, faint slicing sound. The world in her eyes had dissolved into blurred patches of light and shadow. Her ankle burned. The hand gripping the wooden beam trembled violently. "You would not dare," Martha screamed. Snap. The rope broke. Nayeli's body dropped straight down, her head nearly striking the ground. But before she could crash into the hardened dust, a strong arm caught her by the shoulder and pulled her off to the side. The impact still knocked the air from her lungs. The world spun. She coughed hard, fighting to drag air into lungs that felt crushed tight. Blood from her ankle soaked through the torn leg of her dress. Jonah dropped to one knee, steadying her so she would not collapse again. He did not clutch her. He did not squeeze, just enough to keep her from hitting the ground. "Breathe," he said quietly. Slowly, his voice was no longer a command. It was simply a steady rhythm in the middle of chaos. Martha rushed forward. "That girl stole. She hid something that does not belong to her." Jonah rose to his feet, placing himself between Martha and Naili. He did not draw his gun, but the way he stood straight, grounded, unyielding, made the two ranch hands behind her stop in their tracks. "You just hanged her nearly to death," Jonah said. "If that is how you handle family matters, you should be prepared to explain it in court." "Court?" Martha scoffed. "You think this town will listen to an Apache girl over me?" Naili forced herself upright. Blood still pounded in her head, her ears ringing, but she heard every word clearly. She lifted her eyes to Jonah. For the first time, their gazes met at the same level. It was not a look of pleading, not gratitude, only a silent question. "Are you truly going to stand your ground?" Jonah looked at the crisscrossed lash marks on her shoulders, at the blood seeping from her ankle. Then he turned back to Martha. "If you touch her one more time," he said slowly, "you will have more than a courtroom to answer to." The yard fell silent. Wind swept across the dry fields, making the wooden gate creak once more, but now there was no rope swaying from it. Jonah bent down, picked up the severed rope, and tossed it aside like trash. "Can you walk?" he asked Naili. She tried to stand. Her knees buckled. Jonah did not ask again. He stepped forward and lifted her gently. No force, no rough pulling, simply guiding her arm over his shoulder. Martha stood there, her face drained pale with fury. "You will regret this," she said. Jonah led Naili toward his horse. "Maybe," he replied, "but not today." And for the first time since the sun had climbed high into the sky, Naili was no longer suspended between earth and air. She walked away. Jonah's cabin sat deep inside a narrow canyon, where the wind blew through with a sound like an endless whisper. By sunset, Naili was able to sit upright beside the fire. Her ankle had been wrapped in clean cloth. The lash marks across her back had been washed with warm water and strong spirits. She did not cry when Jonah touched the wounds, but her shoulders were drawn tight as a bowstring. Jonah did not ask about the letter right away. He simply placed a tin cup of water in front of her. "What did you hide that made her willing to kill you?" he asked, after a long silence. Naili stared into the flames. The firelight flickered across her still swollen face. "My stepfather's letter," she said softly. "The document proving ownership of that land, written before he died." Jonah did not look surprised. He only gave a slight nod. "And she wants it gone." Naili nodded. Outside, the darkness thickened. She began to relax, just a little, until the sound of horse hooves echoed in the distance. One, then two, then more. Jonah rose at once. He stepped out onto the porch. On the slope in front of the cabin, 3 figures appeared beneath the pale moonlight. Martha Kane sat tall in her saddle. The familiar whip was still in her hand. "Jonah Hale," she called out. "I am giving you one last chance." Naili stood just behind the doorway, her heart pounding hard in her chest. "Return the letter. If not, I will come back and burn this place down to the stone foundation." Jonah stood in the center of the porch, his shadow stretching long across the ground. "You have made enough threats for one day," he replied. "Go home." Martha let out a thin laugh. "You think I am joking? I am not afraid of fire." The wind picked up, rolling dry dust across the earth. Naili stepped out to stand beside Jonah. She was still weak, but she did not step back. Martha saw her, and her gaze turned colder. "That girl does not belong to you," she said, "and neither does that land. The law will decide that," Jonah answered. "The law?" Martha snorted. "In this town, the law listens to me first." A long silence followed. Then she pulled hard on the reins. "You have 3 days, Martha said. 3 days to decide whether you want to protect an Apache girl or keep your cabin." She turned her horse. The figures slowly disappeared into the night. Only the sound of wind whistling through the rocks remained. Naili stood still, her eyes fixed on the road they had taken. "She will come back," she said. Jonah looked over his shoulder at the old wooden cabin behind him, worn but solid. "I know. The fire inside the hearth crackled and flared, and for the first time since she had been cut down from the wooden gate, Naeli understood that freedom did not mean safety. It only meant the fight had just begun. 3 days passed in a heavy silence. Jonah did not stray far from the cabin. Naeli forced herself to walk more each day, even though her ankle still throbbed sharply every time it touched the ground. Neither of them mentioned the threat again, but they both heard it in every gust of wind that slipped through the canyon. On the third night, Jonah had to ride into town to buy medicine and a handful of nails to reinforce the door. He returned when the moon was already high. From a distance, he saw a strange glow against the canyon walls. Not moonlight, fire. He drove his horse into a full gallop. The cabin burned like a giant torch in the black canyon. Flames licked across the wooden roof, devouring each plank with sharp, furious cracks. "Naeli!" Jonah shouted, his heart nearly stopping in his chest. He leapt down from his horse when he saw a figure standing a few steps away from the cabin. "Naeli!" She stood still in the blaze of firelight, her face glowing red in its violent shine. The wind whipped her long hair back as ash spiraled around her feet. "Are you hurt?" Jonah gripped her shoulders. She shook her head. "She came back when I went to the creek for water," Naeli said, her voice hoarse. "They poured oil along the back wall. I did not have time." A heavy crash sounded from inside. Part of the roof began to cave in. Jonah stared at the house he had built with his own hands, board by board, the place he had believed would be the last quiet shelter of his life. Everything collapsed within minutes. He said nothing. He simply stood there, watching the fire consume his past. Naeli lowered her head. "I am sorry." Jonah turned to her. "For what?" "For the letter." The flames reflected in her eyes. Not fear, but guilt. "It is not here," she said softly. Jonah stilled. "What did you say?" "I am not foolish enough to keep it in the cabin." Naeli met his gaze. "Before she hanged me from the gate, I hid it. Somewhere she would never think to look." The fire roared behind them, but in that moment, Jonah no longer heard the burning. He only heard her words. Martha had reduced a home to ashes for something that had never been there. Jonah watched embers drift down to the ground. Then he said slowly, his voice lower than ever, "We have no reason left to hide." Naeli looked at him. The wind shifted. "Tomorrow," Jonah said, "we ride into town." The cabin burned down to its stone foundation, but the one thing Martha wanted most remained untouched. And for the first time since she had been left hanging upside down from the wooden gate, Naeli no longer felt like she was running. She was preparing to face what came next. Dawn rose over the canyon, carrying the faint smell of smoldering ash. The stone foundation where the cabin had once stood was still warm. Thin smoke drifted through the air like a memory that refused to fade. Jonah tightened the saddle on his horse. He did not look at the ruins again. "Where is it?" he asked. Naeli turned toward the small creek a few miles away. The water flowed quietly over gray stones, as if the fire had never happened. "Somewhere she would never lower herself to step," she replied. They walked part of the way because the terrain was steep and narrow. Naeli's ankle still hurt, but she did not make a sound. Every step was an act of defiance. Near a bend in the creek, she stopped in front of an old birch tree, its trunk hollow at the base. She knelt and reached deep into the dark opening. Jonah held his breath. When she pulled her hand back out, tucked between damp soil and strips of bark was a small cloth pouch, tightly bound with a leather cord. She opened it. Inside lay the letter. The edges of the paper yellowed with age, but the wax seal still intact. Jonah studied the signature at the bottom, bold and steady. "Your father wrote this." Naeli nodded. "He knew she would try to take the land. He asked me to keep it safe. I did not think she would go this far." Jonah glanced at the faint ash still clinging to her shoulder. "There are people," he said slowly, "who grow quiet when they are cornered, and there are people who choose to burn everything around them." Naeli tightened her grip on the letter. "I do not want to burn anything back." "Then we will not burn," Jonah answered. We walked through the front door. They stood silently for a moment beside the water. Wind skimmed across the creek's surface, breaking the morning light into shimmering fragments. "The town will not be eager to listen to me," Naeli said. "I am an Apache girl. She has money. She has coins to sway them." Jonah turned to her. "The county court is not her backyard, and if they will not listen to you, they will listen to me." Her gaze paused for a second, not because he said he would protect her, but because he said we. Nayeli slipped the letter back into the pouch and tied it tight. She thinks I only know how to run, she said. She thinks fire will make me afraid. Jonah removed his hat and brushed off the last traces of ash. Fire can burn down a house, he said, but it cannot burn the truth. They mounted their horses and turned toward the road that led down to town. Behind them, the canyon lay silent. No cabin, no clear stile, only two people riding toward the place they once avoided, and this time they did not carry fear. They carried proof. The town was more crowded than usual that morning. News of the fire in the canyon had spread fast, like wind racing across dry grass. People gathered in small clusters outside the county courthouse, whispering and casting sideways glances as Jonah and Nayeli rode in. The looks were not friendly, but they were not entirely cold either. Martha Kane had arrived early. She wore a neatly pressed black dress, her hair pinned up without a strand out of place. There was no trace of the night's fire on her face. When she saw Nayeli, her eyes darkened. "You actually brought her here?" she asked Jonah. "You think the court will believe a savage girl over me?" Jonah did not answer. He simply stepped past her and pushed open the courthouse door. Inside, the wooden room was hot and thick with the smell of sweat. The judge sat behind a long desk and tapped his gavel lightly. Martha Kane accuses Nayeli of property destruction and theft of documents. The clerk read aloud. A wave of murmuring swept through the room. Nayeli stood straight in the center. Her ankle was still wrapped in bandages. The bruised marks from being hanged upside down were still visible. "Do you have anything to say?" the judge asked. She did not look at Martha. She stared straight ahead.
"I did not steal," she said. "I kept what belongs to my father."
She opened the cloth pouch. The entire room fell silent as the letter was placed on the desk. Jonah stepped forward.
"The seal is intact," he said.
The signature confirms ownership of the land in her father's name, signed before he passed. The judge examined it carefully. His expression shifted. Martha let out a sharp laugh. "Forgery. Everyone knows Indians cannot read." Several people in the room stiffened, but before the air could tilt in her favor, a voice rose from the back. "I have seen that letter before." Heads turned. It was the ranch's former foreman, the old manager who had retired the year before. "I signed as a witness when her father drew up the document." Mrs. Kane knew about it. The mood in the room shifted. Martha's face drained of color. "You are lying, and there is the matter of the cabin fire," Jonah added. 3 riders that night, horseshoe tracks leading straight from her land. The judge struck the gavel. "Order." He looked at Martha, then at Nayeli. "There is sufficient cause to investigate charges of unlawful seizure and arson." 2 sheriffs stepped forward. Martha backed away. "You cannot." But her wrists were already seized as she was led out of the room. Her eyes locked onto Nayeli. "You will regret this." Nayeli did not lower her head. She did not answer. She simply stood upright for the first time, not hanging, not dragged, not silenced. The judge turned to her. "Ownership will be formally reviewed. Until a final ruling is made, you are protected under the law." The murmuring stopped. Only the silence of something shifting remained. And for the first time, justice did not turn its back. Autumn came early that year. Wind swept across the fields that once belonged to Martha Kane, now lying quiet beneath a high, open sky. The final verdict came after weeks of investigation. Ownership of the land was restored according to Nayeli's father's will. Martha Kane was convicted of arson and abuse. When the wagon carrying her away rolled out of town, no one stepped forward to see her off. No one cried. The wooden gate where Nayeli had once been hanged upside down still stood. Jonah remained a few steps back as she walked toward it. The faint mark where the rope had once bitten into the crossbeam was still visible in the wood. She reached out and touched it. No trembling, no pulling away. A soft wind moved through her long hair. "You can take it down," Jonah said, meaning the old wooden frame. Nayeli shook her head. "No," she replied. "Let it stand. Just not the rope." She turned to look at him. "Let people remember." Several townsfolk had begun helping rebuild the cabin in the canyon. It was not larger than before, but it was stronger. New timber, a new roof, a sturdier door. Martha Kane's name was gone. Only land and sky remained. The new cabin was finished on a bright afternoon. Jonah set down the final nail. He said nothing, only watched Nayeli standing on the porch. She no longer carried the posture of someone left hanging in a yard. Her back was straight. Her eyes did not turn away. I am not afraid of ropes anymore, she said softly. Jonah looked at her. But you remember? She nodded. I remember, so I will never stay silent again. A warm silence settled between them. No grand promises, no solemn vows, just presence. The wind moved through the canyon, no longer carrying the smell of smoke. Nayeli stepped off the porch and stood in the open stretch of land. Sunlight fell across her shoulders, softening the scars beneath healed skin. She had once been hanged upside down to protect a letter. Now she stood upright to protect the truth. And where the rope once hung, there was only wind. Many years later, people still walked past that wooden gate and reached out to touch the old mark carved into the crossbeam, not to remember an act of cruelty, but to remember a choice. Nayeli did not become a symbol of revenge. She did not hang anyone from that gate. She did not turn her pain into a weapon. She did something far simpler. She refused to stay silent. In a small town where people once turned their faces away because it was a family matter, one man stopped his horse, one girl held tightly to a letter, and one truth was not burned down with a house. Justice did not arrive because of gunfire. It arrived because someone chose to walk through the front door instead of slipping out the back. Some people believe strength means never falling. But Nayeli did fall in the most literal way from a rope. What made her strong was not that she had never been hanged. It was that after she was cut down, she chose to stand upright. And Jonah as well. He did not come to that town to be a hero. He simply refused to look away. Sometimes, a society does not collapse because of cruel people. It collapses because good people decide it is none of their business. That wooden gate still stands without a rope. And whenever the wind moves through the canyon, people remember, truth can be hidden, homes can be burned. But if someone is brave enough to say, take her down, then darkness will never hold this world for long. The story you are following contains many fictional elements recreated with the aid of artificial intelligence. Please listen with your own consideration and feelings. These fictional details are not intended to change history, but to evoke the spirit of the old Wild West where people had to live amidst harsh conditions, make difficult choices, and accept the consequences. Through this story, I only hope to share some valuable lessons about compassion, love, and courage, things that remain relevant even as time passes. I appreciate you taking the time to listen. If you enjoyed this story, leave a number 1 in the comments, and if you feel comfortable, join us by subscribing to the Best Wild West Stories. The Best Wild West Stories.